Hey everyone, hope you are well, staying well, and I hope your first week online went as well as it could. So here we are, I guess our second round of this, right? And we're starting Camus, Albert Camus today. And before we do, though, I just want to maybe pick up on some things, maybe some loose threads with Schopenhauer that I saw coming up on the discussion board a couple of times. I tried to respond to it a little bit there, but it's worth maybe just going over a bit here so that folks have it, because it seemed to be a recurring theme. So one of the things we find with Schopenhauer, right, and I think this we've got down where he's saying, look, life is this kind of endless cycle of desiring, wanting things, trying to satisfy those desires, trying to fulfill ourselves, and we have limited success in that. And even when we are fulfilled, we are creating these new desires, right, and these new wants, which keep that cycle going. So he says that makes our life somewhat restless, right? And the course of our life is pretty much a restless course. Now, he does say that there are ways in which to slow yourself down in this kind of constant perpetuation of desires and seeking to satisfy those desires. And that would be in two ways. One, you can kind of try to emulate the monk or the person who goes off and renounces the world to try to minimize and limit the kinds of desires and wants that you accumulate over life, so that you have some kind of command of where your will would push you. Now, he thinks you, even in this effort, will only be mildly successful, but some of the most fierce and the most powerful efforts that human beings can commit themselves to, for Schopenhauer, would be this type of effort where you practice a kind of renunciation of things, where you actually resist the will within you and defy it. You seek to deny it in order to quiet it, in order to calm it, in order so that you can live a life a bit more peacefully. So there's that. And then there's also what he says is our involvement with art. That art is not just entertainment, but that art is a way for us to look at ourselves, to observe ourselves, to understand ourselves at a distance. That when we watch, let's say, a play unfold, a tragedy unfold on the stage, that what we find there are characters like ourselves going through all kinds of ups and downs, right? And all of those emotions swirling around in that play. And we can see that and be viewers of that without ourselves being fully immersed as participants in that, right? So we may be moved, and we may be moved to tears even, but we do it in such a way where we're in sympathy with those characters, and we understand what those characters are going through, and perhaps we understand ourselves better. But we are not in that play going through those emotions like, let's say, we were in real life, right? So it gives us a way to kind of reflect on the human condition without being sucked into that condition at that moment. So by creating art, you can create that distance slightly, and create that space for you to then contemplate and become a bit more enlightened about your own condition, a way to separate yourself from the will which pushes you into these situations in the first place. So those two things are, I think, worth mentioning, or this is all worth mentioning, just given some of the discussion that's been happening. Now, I do, as we lead into Camus, I want to remind you that Schopenhauer isn't an existentialist, but he influences the existentialists. And Nietzsche, no doubt, certainly is responding to Schopenhauer and working with his philosophy and working eventually against his philosophy. And then you have a line of philosophers who we today are focusing on, Albert Camus, who is not calling Schopenhauer out by name, but is certainly wrestling with what is Schopenhauer's nihilism. Now, what do we mean here by nihilism? Nihilism is the view that there is no meaning inherent in the world, that the world has no meaning to it, existence has no meaning to it. There are different forms of nihilism. There's nihilism about truth, which would say there's no such thing as truth. There's nihilism about morality, which would say there's no such thing as good and evil, or right and wrong inherent in the world. Schopenhauer would agree there is no inherent, well, you can argue he's not exactly consistent on this position, but there are times where he argues there's no inherent good or evil in the world, although the way he depicts the world, he certainly has a disparaging view of it, as if it is an evil because of the pain in it. But we can say, at least when it comes to meaning, Schopenhauer does say there is no meaning to the world. There's no meaning to the will. There's no meaning to the manifestations of the will. There's nothing beyond just the mere existence of things. And the existentialists are having to, work in the kinds of ruins that are made of this view among many other views. I mean, there are many other nihilists, philosophers, and this view isn't just Schopenhauer's, but he certainly gives us one of the more forceful pictures of it. And so you have folks like Sartre, you have folks like Nietzsche, you have folks like Heidegger, all trying to form and figure out how do we understand meaning or making meaning in a world without meaning. And this is Camus' project as well. So even if we say there is no meaning, there's a question then about what do we do with that, right? What do we do with that fact or that truth about our existence? So a couple of things about Camus here. These are his dates. As you can see, he did not live long. He was 47 when he died, and he died in a car accident. And the sad irony of it is he was found on the scene of this accident with a train ticket that was leaving earlier that day, as if and going to the destination that he was going. So he had, kind of in a last second, decided to get a car ride with, I believe, his agent or publisher, a friend of his, to his destination, and in that ride got into this accident which took his life. Had that train ticket still in his wallet. These are the works: The Stranger, The Myth of Sisyphus, The Plague, The Rebel, The Fall. So The Stranger is a novel, and you may have read The Stranger. Some of you may have read The Stranger. And I won't get too much into it just for the sake of time, but it's a classic work which, in narrative form, in fictional form, brings to life some of the themes we find in The Myth of Sisyphus, which you did have an excerpt from. And that is a book-length essay that Camus wrote and really kind of broke him into the philosophical scene, if you will. The Plague is it's quite a relevant novel, has been and is more so now, where it's a depiction of a city that's overtaken by a disease, and the whole city is suffering because of this disease. And Camus takes up several perspectives of different characters in this city and renders the question of how do you find meaning, how do you find a life worth living in a situation as dire and as a situation where you have a plague running uncontrollably through a city. So it's actually on my list to read. within a few days. I have a few other things I'm finishing up here, and I've only read pieces of it, and I'm sitting down in the next week or so and going to read that. The Rebel, in fact, is something I'm reading right now, and it's a later work of his which builds on some things that occur in the myth of Sisyphus. Um, I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then another novel, The Fall, which he wrote not let's say, he died shortly after, not too long after that novel. So those are some major works. And what Camus is very much interested in, pretty much throughout his philosophy, is, and especially in The Stranger, and especially in the myth of Sisyphus, is this question. Look, if life is meaningless, is it without worth? If life is meaningless, is it without worth? He says at the very opening of the myth of Sisyphus, judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. He opens this book with such a powerful, powerful statement. He says there is one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Whether or not life is worth living. That is the most urgent question we can ask ourselves. Every other question is secondary or just comes later, right? Whether or not the world revolves around the sun, or the sun revolves around, the earth revolves around the sun, or the sun revolves around the earth. That question, yeah, is interesting scientifically and can tell us about, how the cosmos works and all of that. But it's not going to help you with this question of, is life worth living? You could still ask that question and still search for an answer to that question, however the facts of the sun revolving around the earth or the earth revolving around the sun played out, right? So a lot of the questions that we think are important in life, even the philosophical questions, he says, that Kant asks about the categories of the mind and phenomena, anomena, all of that stuff is secondary to this question of, is life worth living? And this is what he addresses mostly in the myth of Sisyphus. As I mentioned, he is reckoning with this picture of the world that Schopenhauer gives us, this godless, indifferent world, right? Of just being here on this planet, among planets, in space that is expansive and infinite, and wondering, what the heck are you doing here? Why are you even here? Where are you going? Where did you come from? What is this all about? Camus writes, in a universe suddenly divested of illusions and lights, man feels an alien, right? A stranger on this earth. You're just kind of there, and there's no God. Remember, this is the atheistic existential picture here. There is no God there. And so you feel exiled and without remedy, since you've been deprived of this lost home, this paradise, right, that you thought maybe belonged to you, this promised land that you thought maybe was created for you by a God. But now that there is no God, what are you doing here? Do you even belong here? What has thrust you upon this earth? Does it mean anything? So, can we find worth in a world without meaning? He wants to look at. Can we find value and happiness in a life without meaning? So he's going to answer this, and he wants to make some distinctions. So I want to put down here kind of how his approach to trying to answer this for us, and the rest of the video lectures will unpack that approach and unpack that answer. He says, look, people have played on words and pretended to believe that refusing to grant a meaning to life necessarily leads to declaring that it is not worth living. So, by refusing to grant a meaning to life, he's saying, that does not mean you're refusing the worth of life, right? That these two can be separated. The meaning of life and the worth of life, though the questions might be related, they can be taken up, and if there is no meaning to life, that does not mean there is no worth to life. So a meaningless life, he says, does not entail that life is not worth living, right? It doesn't follow that life is not worth living from a meaningless life. Now, a life worth living for Camus is going to be, as we will see, a life lived without any illusions. It's going to be a lucid life, a clear-eyed life, as clear as you can be as a human being about your situation and circumstances. It's going to be a life committed to those circumstances, a life committed to exhausting what makes you a human being, exhausting your condition as a human being. And by exhausting it, I mean getting everything out of it, maximizing that human condition of yours. The epigram that Camus uses in the myth of Sisyphus to start the work is a quote from Pindar. He says, "O my soul, do not aspire to immortal life, but exhaust the limits of the possible," right? The human condition, the mortal condition, not the immortal condition that a god might live, but your condition as a human being. Exhaust that possibility. And that's what he's going to be after in trying to describe for us what a life worth living is. So, living without illusion is living with what is certain, with what is reckoning only with what you know, what is within the boundaries of human cognition and thought. And B, the human condition itself is an absurd condition, he says. The human condition is absurd. We'll get into what that means in the next video lecture, the absurdity of your condition. But ultimately here, Camus is after some kind of inner harmony of living, to get your beliefs, your principles lined up with your actions and what you take up in this world to do with your life. He says, for a man who does not cheat, what he believes to be true must determine his action. Belief in the absurdity of existence must then dictate his conduct. So Camus is going to first describe to us what the absurdity of existence is, how we feel it, how it takes shape in our lives, how we run into instances in our experiences where that absurdity becomes more apparent to us. And then he's also going to say, okay, what follows from the absurdity of our existence? If we believe our existence is absurd, how are we to respond to that within the dictates of that absurdity, right? So this is what I mean by living coherently in an incoherent world. If the world is incoherent, if it's absurd in some way, how do we live in such a way that is true to that world and true to our condition? Doesn't neglect it or deny it or ignore it or undermine it, but is actually true to it. How do we live in a way that is true to the reality we find ourselves in? So we will take that up in the next video.